Hi, and welcome to the audio highlights for Chapter 4. This chapter is on racism and white privilege. We get started with the chapter with just a quick reflection on the historical foundations of race and racism. So, of course, we look at this from the perspective of society in the United States, but you could look at the different historical foundation across a number of different societies. And so it's important to know as we look at this that while we start from the perspective of the United States, there could be important other historical factors in other countries and other societies that would also be applied to this same study of race and racism. So we also get started with defining race and ethnicity, and it's important to know that those two things are not synonymous. They are often confused, but they're not the same thing. So the U.S. government actually uses racial categories as more of a social construct. So we know that it's not simply physical characteristics or even a group of physical characteristics, that there are a number of different kind of levels to race, and those also include socio-political different variables and socioeconomic status as well. So just knowing that race is more complex than just color of skin or physical characteristics is important. So racial classifications across time have changed a little bit in terms of there's more variability, and that we know that those physical characteristics alone are insufficient to make distinctions among people. So after we define race and ethnicity, we move on in this chapter to define racism, which is an ongoing, multidimensional, and dynamic process. And unfortunately, racism is built to maintain itself. And so what we mean by that is that there's different levels of racism. There's the individual racism, institutional racism, and cultural racism. And one of the reasons that racism is built to last, unfortunately, is that while we oppress one group, a majority group or the dominant group benefits from that oppression. And they benefit from that discrimination whether they want to or not. So if you are a white individual, you experience certain privileges and benefits that were unearned and just kind of ascribed to you upon your birth as a white person. So you didn't ask for that. You may not be actively discriminating or being oppressive against people of color, but the fact that you have those benefits makes it more difficult for you to want to give up those benefits. So if we have an advantage in the world, it's one thing to say that, well, everybody should have equal treatment. It's another thing to say, well, are you willing to give up your advantage to allow someone else to have a more equal treatment or a more equal opportunity or access to opportunities? So this is why racism is kind of built to create this cycle where it continues. And there are real costs to racism. So our chapter talks about not only costs of racism for people of color, but also costs of racism for white people. And so we start with the costs of racism for people of color. And these include anything from cognitive costs, like the mental energy that it takes to think about racism and to deal with it and to combat it. And this is particularly true in today's era of racism, in where it's almost become socially unpopular to be outwardly racist. So people may not express their views directly to someone, but they may just treat someone differently, and it may be even a minor indifference. But what it leaves is this, it can even be a feeling of paranoia, because it leaves one to question, wow, why did she talk to me differently than she did the person before me in line? And was that racism? And did they treat me like that because I'm a person of color? Or so these questions are mental energy that's spent, and it's draining, it's frustrating. So we can move on to the affective costs in terms of sometimes feeling angry and depressed and just stressed and hypervigilant, more likely to pay attention to these things. And there's also interpersonal costs, and these are experienced by both people of color and white people, in terms of that the segregation of people by racial classification that we have. And again, this isn't mandated by law anymore, but if you look at many neighborhoods, it's still happening. And the cost of that is that relationships aren't being formed that could be formed. And these relationships could range anywhere from dating to good relationships with coworkers to having a good neighborly relationship. So these are also costs that people of color are experiencing due to racism. Another cost is actual physical costs, so costs to health, hypertension, chronic fatigue. There's a number of outcomes that are more poor among people of color when it's related to health care. And so these are documented in the research and kind of cold, hard evidence of the cost of racism on people of color. We've talked a little bit about privilege, and we've given examples in terms of privilege is that unearned kind of boost or positive benefit that you have as a member of a dominant group. And so it's important to be aware of our privilege so that we can hopefully not use that privilege against others. We may not be able to get rid of our privilege, but we need to be aware of it so that we can recognize when those unearned benefits may be asserting power or control over others. So Peggy McIntosh was the one who first wrote about white privilege, and she used this metaphor of an invisible, weightless knapsack. And she said that this knapsack was full of assurances, tools, maps, guides, code books, passports, visas, clothes, a compass, emergency gear, and blank checks. So if you think about it in terms of kind of going off into the world, or maybe going off into the world and in kind of an end of the world situation, think about what advantage you would be if you had this backpack full of all these things versus somebody who had nothing. And so that's an excellent metaphor for white privilege in terms of the person that has that backpack isn't going to want to give it up. And they maybe didn't even ask for it or didn't earn it, but it's important for them to at least be aware that they have this knapsack and that another individual doesn't. So I want you to take a minute to look in our learning links to go over. Peggy McIntosh provided some great, clear, practical examples of what we mean by white privilege. It's a term that's hard to wrap your head around when you only read about it theoretically, but I think she gives some great examples of what we mean by that in terms of when does this happen in everyday life. Our chapter also looks at the costs of racism for whites. So again, as I mentioned, there's the cost of interpersonal relationships. And while these costs are fairly minimal compared to people of color, there's still something that we should acknowledge. There could also be costs in terms of an irrational sense of danger or fear of people of color. And then there may be anxiety due to guilt. So especially once you learn about privilege and maybe your unconscious or subconscious role in the oppression of others, that can be a source of anxiety and guilt for some people who take that very seriously. So as we go through, we also look some at the psychological responses to racism and white privilege. So how do people generally respond to this? One way they respond, and not in such a positive way, but a common way, is denial. And so an example of denial would be a colorblind racial attitude. If you've heard people say, I don't see your color, I only see you as Bob, or I only see the person, I don't see the person's race. When people say that, they mean well, they think that this is a positive thing to say, but what you're really saying is that I don't see a huge part of you. And if I don't see race, then I also don't see the very real experiences that you have related to racism. So the reason this is not a good approach is that when we look at research where counselors use this approach, we see that they have a lot of trouble establishing trust with clients and establishing that therapeutic alliance, which is key to having change within a counseling relationship. So I really want to advise you against that in terms of even though it's well intentioned, it makes it very hard to trust a person because we know that race is actually there and it's more than just a person's skin color. And so to say that you don't see it is denying a huge part of that person's identity and experience. Another thing that you're going to commonly hear, but we want to avoid because it's another example of a focus on exception or denial, is the myth of meritocracy. So the idea that when people say, well, if only they, meaning a minority group, would just work hard, they could get somewhere too. And this comes from the assumption that we all work from the same starting place, and that's not the case. So it's not to say that minority individuals can't work hard and achieve amazing things, but this statement is unfair because it is neglecting to recognize that it takes more than hard work. And there are in some cases that a person may be working very hard, but if they're working hard in a system of racism, they may not get as far as an individual who is white may get. So this is another example of a myth that is just basically denying white privilege, and it's an implicit way to continue racism as well. A term that I want to clarify is reverse discrimination. So there are definitely instances where whites are also discriminated against by people of color because they're white. So it's not to say that that doesn't happen, but it's important to recognize that the implications of that happening are far less than the scale and the intensity and the pervasiveness of racism that's perpetuated against people of color. So what I mean by this is that are people discriminated against because they're white, usually discriminated against by people of color? Definitely, but it doesn't nearly have the negative impact across systems and across generations that racism has. It's not to invalidate it, it's just to recognize the difference in scale. And also to clarify, this is never racism. So sometimes you'll inaccurately hear people describe this as reverse racism. Racism can only be perpetuated against a minority group by a dominant group. So an African American could not be racist because their race is a member of the minority group, of the oppressed group. So it's inaccurate to call it reverse discrimination. It's inaccurate to call it reverse racism. The appropriate term is reverse discrimination. So as we go through the different psychological dispositions, this kind of reminds us of the previous chapter in terms of different stages and different stages of psychological awareness that a person may have or that you may have as you go through in learning about racism and learning about white privilege as well. Our chapter concludes with some ideas about eradicating racism. I want you to spend a great deal of your focus on developing self-awareness and your own attitudes and behaviors regarding racism and racial privilege, but also I hope that you'll extend that in terms of eventually working with clients and then also changing systems. So I mentioned at the start of this chapter the importance of understanding historical context, and then our chapter actually concludes with the different historical and current legislation that addresses racial issues. So you can be a part of this change now that you're well informed and that hopefully you're dedicated and committed to being a social advocate of social justice. So I hope these audio highlights were helpful. As usual, I hope that you'll take a moment to look at the reflection boxes within your chapter. I think that they're also helpful within this chapter as well. And I think especially activity 4.2, which is on page 100, it looks at different items that might symbolize what it means to be a member of your race. And so we don't have the advantage to do this in small groups as suggested, but you could definitely think about what items you might bring in if we did do this activity, and what items you maybe even have in your home or your room that represent your identity as a member of your race.